Hello, and welcome to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, aka the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, that took place 77 years ago today. I will be your guest historian for today's session, and I hope you don't mind me doing that, because, well, I rather enjoy it. Roughly, this is a long patrol, and roughly this will be about 90 minutes. He says roughly. It should be no more than 2 hours because technically I go live today with. And that's because it's Thursday the 17th of June. I go live with the Great Siege of Gibraltar at 6:30. So it's been a long day. I hope you'll enjoy, and I hope this will be a lot of fun for you all. Now, I'm going to do that quickly. And that's about good enough. So, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It takes place in 1944. So by this point, the war's been going terribly for the Japanese. They have this never-ending confidence, which is amazing. But honestly, at a certain level, it's unfounded. Yes, they are trying to build back of losses, and they have lost a lot. But they're not able to build enough to get back there. They're not. For every carrier they lose, they're not able to replace it. For every 3 carriers they lose, they may be getting 1 more into actual operations. And worse, they are losing experienced pilots. Their air wings are in an absolute atrocious mess because of the way they organise them. If you consider the Royal Navy, the US Navy both work on generating air wings in terms of a squadron basis and in terms of rotating experienced pilots home to become instructors, and then after they've probably served some time as an instructor, sending them out as squadron leaders. So they go out as pilots. They get maybe promoted in the field to a flight leader. Flight leader, they go home as an instructor. They go home to be an instructor. They do a few months as an instructor. Then they go out as a squadron leader or a squadron commander, whatever they're sort of using as a rank at a point. Then they might come back again and do another practice session and more training, and then they'll go out as an air group one. Now, not everyone does that. Some people are very lucky and are kept in the fight the whole way through, but a significant proportion do that and get staff appointments and other things to spread the experience around so that you have experience of air operations in staff, but also have experience of operations training the people coming through. So when you have a massive disaster and, I don't know, you lose a carrier and its entire air group, you have not lost automatically all the institutional memory you have created. Because, frankly, that institutional memory is worth more than the carrier. If we consider the current issues with HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, and the amount of British press who keep harping on about for ages as they were carriers with no planes, and again, political parties do the same thing. We consider the Americans with their current fight to keep a number of aircraft carriers. The French, who depend upon the Americans in many ways to make their single carrier navy viable. Why? Because it's a critical mass of air groups, of operations, of institutional memory. Without which you're in a lot of trouble. And the British did all sorts of things to try and maintain that institutional memory. Because it's not just the pilots. It's the fitters. It's the deck crew. It's all the different levels of support and engineering and systems that you need to be of good quality in order for your carrier to work well. Look at the problems the Japanese, the British, and the Americans run into when they have less than experienced carrier damage control officers, i.e., officers who don't realize that some of the rules you apply when doing damage control to, I don't know, a battleship with a fairly low center of gravity in comparison to versus an aircraft carrier which has a far higher one. These are issues. These are real issues. And this is a very cool picture because this is CV-16 USS Lexington, the Essex class Lexington. That, of course, is USS Washington, the battleship, the amazing one. And flying over both of those is an SPD Dauntless. That is the war in the Pacific. You have got your carrier off in distance. You have got a Dauntless flying watch, looking out for threats. And you have the guard dog, Washington, making sure that nothing will get through to Lexington. It won't get past that. That picture is from the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, which is the campaign which takes place between November 1943 and February 1944. It's the one before the Mariana and Palau Islands campaign, for which the Battle of Philippine Seas is part of. In simple terms, there is a never-ending series of campaigns going on, and the more the campaigns go on, the more the American resources start to bite. The more you have American strength, American technology, but most importantly, American industrial technology starting to matter. America has a lot of space for infrastructure, but in 1939 they don't have anywhere near as much infrastructure as they managed to build by 1941. And certainly not as much infrastructure as they will have by 1944, when this is taking place. And construction infrastructure matters. The Japanese are as limited as they are because of limitations placed on by their own infrastructure, by their own access to natural resources, by their own population strength, and the way in which they run the war. Let's be honest, the way they run the war is very, very silly. In that every 5 minutes it seems to be that the Allies are taking the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy away from their real threat, each other, to ask them to fight a war. You know, it's terribly rude of the Allies, that. The Japanese war strategy, which we're getting into, wasn't built for the war that they ended up fighting. And the American strategy didn't survive first contact with the enemy, but the strategy they ended up implementing, that was very, very good. But in the nicest way, it's also a Pacific rerun version of Scott's Anaconda plan. So I'm going to put this out here. If anyone's ever thinking about what a future war with America would be like, go and have a look at Scott's Anaconda plan and see if it can be actually applied to you in any way, shape or form, because that's the Americans' go-to long war strategy, and my god does it work well. It does. It's a very good strategy. Cut them off from resources and slowly tighten the noose. It works. And expend things rather than people. Japanese strategy. We will have a decisive battle. That is the entire Japanese strategy. For the entirety of World War II, that is their strategy. We will have a decisive battle. And by the way, those are the chiefs of the Navy, the commander-in-chief combined fleet, who are running the operations in order. You have Yamamoto, who is killed by Operation Vengeance in April 1943. His successor, Koga, dies in a plane crash, Kawasaki 8H8K, one of the flying boats, crashes in a typhoon and dies in March 1944. And poor Admiral Suma Toyera is put in charge. What's really interesting is that Yamamoto may have wanted to change strategies. He never seems to be that big a fan on the strategy for war with America, probably because he'd actually visited America and understood how big they were, whereas some of the Japanese officers really don't seem to understand that. They also forget the Americans are incredibly stubborn. They're kind of like the British, in that they don't know when they've been beaten, and so they keep going. And before anyone says that's very patriarchal of the British, there are lots of nations like that. If you consider Britain in World War II, 1940, fall of France, Norway's gone, everything's gone. BEF has come home in trouble after Operation Ariel and Operation Cycle and Operation Dynamo. Britain should have, at that point, by the Japanese metric of decisive battle doctrine, and probably by Hitler's opinion, have sued for peace. They should have realised they'd been beaten. They didn't. You can say there are many reasons why we don't. You can say because Churchill had enough scotch, and as long as he had enough scotch, he wasn't going to give in. You can say it's because the British nation as a whole are inherently stubborn. Or you could just say we just didn't realise the situation, and by the time we did, we'd managed to get through it. Who knows? But at certain times in history, you can say nations don't realise they're beaten, so they carry on fighting and they end up winning. And that's the case in World War II for Britain. It's also the case for America, because after the Battle of Pearl Harbor, they should, in the Japanese decisive battle doctrine, have gone, oh, we've been massacred. Okay, we've been defeated. Or alternatively, have rushed to get honour by attacking headlong into the Japanese forces and charge into the waiting arms of the Japanese battle line with their depleted battle line. The US Navy did neither. They did the Doolittle raid, but that's not really the same thing, and we'll get on to some of the stuff for that as well later, because interesting enough, a lot of the Doolittle raid, one of the key persons of the Doolittle raid, Mitcher, is very key to this battle. So, the Japanese idea is a decisive battle. But, theoretically, because then you look at the actual way they were planning on implementing this whole decisive battle doctrine, and it starts off with, well, we're going to let the enemy come to us. Well, that's not really seeking a decisive battle, is it? Usually when you're seeking a decisive battle, you have to go find the enemy. But you're going to let them come to you. Okay, well, that'll work if they do come to you obligingly. And we're going to whittle them down on the way using our aircraft and submarines and all our sort of guerrilla warfare capabilities that we have sort of developed to launch from islands, to whittle them down. And then we will pounce and we will win. There's, of course, a couple of problems with this idea. One, the idea the Americans are going to come charging straight in and going to keep coming even when they've been losing ships. A sensible admiral might go, I so far haven't found the battle fleet and I have lost my carriers. I will withdraw until I have carriers, because otherwise I could lose the whole fleet. But no. So, the Japanese idea, it's based on the German idea from World War One. Honestly, this is the reality is it's a continuation of that doctrine, of the risk fleet doctrine, the which had turned into the World War One doctrine of finding a small enough section of the ground fleet to annihilate, so that the ground fleet will then equal the same size as the high seas fleet, so the high seas fleet can come out and beat the ground fleet. It never happens. Why? Because their best chances of doing that are against the battlecruiser fleet, and even if you'd taken out the battlecruiser fleet, the Grand Fleet would still have been bigger than the German High Seas Fleet. Yes, they'd have been at a tactical disadvantage in that the German high battlecruisers could have outpaced them, but they couldn't have outfought them, and the trouble for a battlecruiser is, to fight a battleship, you have to get in range of the battleship, which means you're testing your armour against their armour rather than your speed against their speed. Because if you're not able to fire at them, they won't be able to fire at you. But if you're able to fire at them, they will be able to fire at you. Your speed does not give you super range. So, it wasn't going to work for the Germans. And then the Japanese are pushing it. And to be honest, the Japanese with their aircraft carriers and Pearl Harbor, etc., you could say they have a chance to do it. They have a chance to win this. But it comes down to the institutional memory and infrastructure thing. Because they can't replace their losses. Any loss they have, they cannot rebuild. So they can't maintain their strategy. The American numbers just keep going up and up and up. And the amount of American ships you have to take out, the amount of American ships you have to have sunk in order to have parity, just goes up and up and up. As a result, you end up with battles like the Philippine Sea, which, as said earlier, are made worse by the loss of crucial personnel. They haven't got experienced air groups to fly their aircraft. A Zero can beat a Hellcat or a Wildcat. It even has a chance against a Corsair if it's well flown by someone who knows what they're doing and knows what are the advantages of a Zero versus a Corsair or a Wildcat or a Hellcat. And you do get some Japanese aces. The trouble is those aces are kept flying until eventually they are shot down, because either they meet an American ace who knows how to use their aircraft very well to beat them, or they're just unlucky and they meet an American pilot who just gets a good position on them, gets the bounce on them, and they're gone. Whereas with the American aces, if we think Jimmy Fack, the person who comes up with the Fack weave, an excellent fighter pilot. By the end of World War II, he isn't a fighter pilot running around. He's a staff officer. He's doing all sorts of other jobs. That experience has been brought back in. He's done in training. He's done all sorts of other roles to help out his force. He hasn't just kept being chucked into the battle again and again and again. He's been one of those officers who've gone, ooh, you've got good experience, good ideas. Nab. Take you back. Use you for other things. Use you to train pilots. That's useful. It's critical. The American strategy. Look, I'm probably going to get people going, why didn't you put in the political leaders and the various other things? Politicians will have a say. They will have a yes or no. In the Japanese system, they have far less of a say. And perhaps you could say the Emperor, but again, no, he's not going to get involved in much operations. Moray should have probably put some of the army generals there, but that would be very strange to get into discussing the Japanese army and their involvement in the strategy. In the American equivalent, you have Chester Nimitz. Yes, you have MacArthur going on and going, I'm going back to New Guinea, I'm going back to the Philippines, Indonesia, I will get them all, I will return. Well, that's good, that's lovely. MacArthur's down the bottom there. You can see his arrow. The rest is all Nimitz. And Nimitz's policy is quite simple. I want to get to Japan. But I'm not an idiot. I know Japan has planning to use its submarines and its aircraft to whittle away my forces as I try to get to Japan. They'll be launching from islands. Hang on. Those islands are also useful for me to bring logistics forward, so I don't have to have my ships going back a long way to refuel from Hawaii, and I can instead refuel them, rearm them, from closer. I could also use the Air Force to launch, well, the US Army Air Force at this point, to launch long-range strikes from those islands if I get the islands close enough to Japan. There you go. I wish to impose a blockade and eventually starve and then invade Japan. To do this, I need places close to Japan. Comes back to those islands again. I will come up with a strategy called island hopping, where I will go from island chain to island chain to island chain. And here is the point. The Mariana and Palau Islands. They're quite far up that chain, aren't they? You get them, you've got a long way into that area. That is the extent of Japanese occupation, and by 1944, by June 1944, the Americans are that close. And I can hear a fluffy research assistant. I can hear a fluffy research assistant. Vicky, go on. He might pop in, he might not. Who knows? Oh, he has popped in. You popped in for American strategy, or you popped in for a biscuit? Which was it? What can I say? Probably is the American strategy. Go behave for your sissy now. Don't get too wet. The American strategy is winning. Their advantages are simple. They're using their industrial might to take over the territory, to get themselves closer and closer to Japan. Eventually, they might have to invade Japan. But you're beautiful. But their aim, before that, is to isolate Japan. Because if they isolate Japan off and stop it being able to resupply its force in China, then their allies in China can win. Support its force in Korea, then they can hopefully liberate Korea. But also that would make Stalin very happy because he has ambitions on certain areas in the world. And so, the American strategy, as said, is simple. It's also devastatingly effective, because what the Americans do is they surge forward, they take an island chain, they fight, and then they return back and regroup. And they keep building the whole time. So they replace their losses. More than replace their losses, they're growing their fleet. CV-16, which I showed a photo of earlier, is a brand new carrier. She's replacing the Lexington, which was lost already during World War II. And they keep growing. They keep on growing. So, let's look at the commands for this operation. The Japanese command structure. We have Vice Admiral Yusabe Ozawa on the Aigen Taiho is in charge. Second in command, and in commander of the van, forward group, is Vice Admiral Taiko Kurita on Aigen Atago. Now, at a certain point, I'm going to get really, really annoyed with the way they set them up. I don't want you licking varnish. It's not good for you. But these are the officers. They're experienced officers. They're good officers. They're given a freaking annoying job to do. But they're going to do their best. Sorry, Fluffy Research Assistant has gone. It's starting to rain outside and he hasn't got a coat, so had to go in just in case he got soaked later, because wet wool is not fun to live with. Anyway. So, we had Vice Admiral Taiko Kurita. Now, I would point out, is in charge of the van from Atago. I had something quite interesting, because on Wikipedia, you have Kauji Kakuta listed as one of the officers, and he is of course in charge of the land-based naval aircraft located throughout the Philippines. However, after the raids in February 1944 and various other things, he doesn't really have much forces there to be involved in. So he's listed as one of the senior commanders, but he's not the second in command. He's not the one doing the operations. In contrast, the Americans, they have Admiral Spruance, who is the 5th Fleet commander, who is sailing on the USS Indianapolis, hopping along going, "Hello, I'm in charge." And you have Admiral Mitscher on the USS Lexington with his Chief of Staff, the almighty, the wonderful. There is a whole class of destroyers named after him which are still critical to the US Navy to this day, Arleigh Burke. In fact, they are so critical they're still being built. So I would argue from a US perspective the two really running the battle are these two, because Mitscher at best takes occasional notice of what Spruance tells him, at worst does things first and then tells Spruance he's done them. But Mitscher, of course, had been in charge of, well, Mitscher's been in charge of aircraft and carriers for a long, long time. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he knows exactly what he needs to do. So, frankly, in my opinion, he's probably the best carrier admiral in World War II. That's going to get me into trouble with a lot of Lonely Lister fans. And people are probably going to wonder why I'm not singing Admiral Philip Vian's phrases here. But Vian is a very good admiral, and he certainly does his best with the carriers, but he is a destroyerman. And he is a fleet command officer, certainly. But I wouldn't call him necessarily a carrier admiral. He does his best with carriers, and he certainly does his best to look after them. But he's not a carrier admiral. Mitscher is a carrier admiral. Mitscher is, well, in World War II, he takes part in the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, the Solomon Islands Campaign, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He is just an all-around amazing person. It's even in the Olympics, I think. Not sure. Maybe not. That might have been one of the other officers I was reading about. I think that was one of the other officers I was reading about. But he's worked so hard to get where he was. He amassed so many demerits and poor classwork that he was forced to resign at the end of his sophomore year when trying to going through Naval Academy. Ends up having to re-enlist as a plebe and come back and start again. And he managed to work straight through and graduated 113th out of a class of 131 in 1910. You would think with that start he was never going to get anywhere. He gets right to the top. He is a key officer. And Mitscher, post World War II, is one of the key people who supports carrier aviation and retains it. He's so incensed by some of the, how do I put this, air advocates in the Air Force claiming it was entirely strategic bombers which had beaten Japan with nuclear bombs and they could now do away with the Army or Navy. He releases a statement to the press. Japan is beaten and carrier supremacy defeated her. Carrier supremacy destroyed her army and navy air forces. Carrier supremacy destroyed her fleet. Carrier supremacy gave us bases adjacent to her home islands, and carrier supremacy finally left her exposed to the most devastating sky attack, the atomic fission bomb, that man has suffered. When I say carrier supremacy defeated Japan, I do not mean air power in itself won the Battle of the Pacific. We exercised our carrier supremacy as part of a balanced, integrated air, surface, ground team, in which all hands may be proud of the role assigned to them, and in a way which their duties were discharged. This could not have been done by a separate air force, exclusively based ashore, or by one not under a navy control. He is a very, very balanced and fine officer. And frankly, that is a wonderful way to put it. He's talking about carrier supremacy. Not naval aviation, carrier supremacy. And there's a reason for that. As I've talked about in the past, aircraft carriers are a team. As we talked about with the problem of the Japanese carriers, the problem is their team has suffered so much. The US carriers are building up, but they are still a team. They are not just a ship with an airfield on top. They are a carrier. They are a team. They might have senior officers, and you'll be seeing when I'm listing the air group commanders next to captains, because they are mentioned and because they need to be discussed, but not because that means that there are two groups on a ship and never the twain may meet. The air group is not separate from the carrier is not separate from the air group. They are one symbiotic force. There is also a good point here. The Americans have their operational commander on an aircraft carrier, so where he can coordinate strikes. They have their local senior commander on a cruiser, where in many ways he's less of a problem. You haven't got his staff trying to nitpick or micromanage people because they can't. They can't micromanage an airstrike because they don't have the airstrike under control. So they have to sit back and they have to start taking a strategic view and they have to consider what's going on. One of the interesting things we're going to talk about when we get into the battle is the Japanese are not able to take a step back. They do not realise necessarily what's going on. And I think in a way this is because of where their commanders are positioned. And I think it offers a lesson, perhaps, for modern command structures, which are often wedded to the idea of putting the commanders of these forces on the carriers, or putting the commanders ashore a long way home. Either way has problems. The idea of having a commander closer, but not necessarily on one of the critical fighting ships for that operation, has a lot of advantages. And also, let's be honest, a heavy cruiser is strong enough to survive, but not so important a target that the enemy are probably going to pick her over carriers, which means he is as secure as he can be to provide continuity of command. Japanese don't really seem to have much in the way of continuity of command planning. Probably why they have so many vice admirals there. Let's look at this fleet. Now, I've got bolded things which were lost. The vast majority of the air groups were wiped out. Okay? They lost a lot of aircraft. They also lost a fair number of destroyers. And I've managed to miss out Hyanni, which was sunk by a 7th of June by a submarine. That was for my own notes. But, and I have to admit, and I will say this only, to make sure I got the spellings right, I did copy and paste out of Wikipedia, because believe it or not, my keyboard does not do Japanese spellings that correctly. But then I adapted and edited adding this stuff for my own thing. Here is my problem with this fleet structure. You have got Vice Admiral Jisauru Oza in the Taiho. The Taiho is part of Alpha Force, which is under Oswa. Okay. Which is has Carrier Division 1, also under Oswa. So, Oswa is in charge of the mobile fleet, and so he's in charge of the overall force. He's directly in charge of the task group, let's say, A force, underneath that, within that force. And then he's directly in charge of his own task unit within that task group. His carrier groups. So you've got one admiral and one staff responsible for 3 levels of command. The Japanese are short of people, yes. But there's no reason for them to be that short. Yes, you could have combined Commander Force A with being Commander of the Mobile Fleet. You can do that. You can combine the two. Because they're really quite a similar level and you're coordinating with the Van Force, so that makes sense. But that means you should have given the Carrier Division 1 to a Rear Admiral. And then you've got lots of Rear Admirals going around in charge of cruiser divisions and various other things. But you're not making use of them. And then you go to, okay, so let's see. Kurita. Takao Kurita, where is he? Oh, he's in charge of Cruiser Division 4. So he is his task group and a task unit commander as well. Overall, they have 3 light carriers, 3 fleet carriers, 2 converted fleet carriers, and another light carrier spread over the 3 forces: the Van Force, the Alpha Force, and the B Force. B Force centered on Carrier Division 2, under the command of Rear Admiral Tajika Joshima, who is also in charge of Carrier Division 2. So again, task group and task unit commander. Now, you can probably mix 2 levels together. So task group and task unit, I prefer you didn't, especially not with a Carrier Division, but you can probably do it. When you're coordinating a strike to be flown off 3 aircraft carriers, because your air group is spread over air units spread over 3 aircraft carriers, I'd really prefer you weren't, but that's what I like. Ozawa is the one I have the real big problem with. And you do have another Vice Admiral here. You have Vice Admiral Matome, who's in charge of Battleship Division 1, which has Yamato and Musashi, the 2 really big battleships. You have 4 Vice Admirals. Yeah, 4 Vice Admirals there. You need 3 task group commanders and a task force commander. You have 4 Vice Admirals. Use them. If Ozawa does have to be task force commander and run his carrier division, that's fine. Swap Cruiser Division 5 with Cruiser Division 4, and Kurita can take command of A Force. And you can use one of the battleship Vice Admirals to run Van Force. You've got 2 of them. Pick. If you're going to leave B Force under the command of Joshima, that's fine. Okay? He's a very good Rear Admiral. He will do a good job. But there is not much point in deploying 4 Vice Admirals, and you've got 2 trying to run everything and 2 who are literally in charge of a pair of battleships each. That seems to be a lot of experience being wasted. You've got 3 Vice Admirals in Van Force alone. The Japanese Navy is a competent naval force. They should have been able to figure this out. Honestly, they should have had a full admiral able to go down to be the force commander. Again, you have huge battleships, you have converted aircraft, you have converted fleet carriers, you have large cruisers wandering around. There are officers available. That they haven't done this suggests that someone's trying to control everything from home. Classic example, of course, is the Falklands War, where Vice Admiral Derek Raffel is only sent south after the war is over to sort things out, even though he is the admiral for carriers and amphibious warfare, because they want to run it from northward. So you send Sandy Woodward down south. He's a rear admiral. As a task group commander, he's in charge of the carrier battle group, but he's a rear admiral, so he's sort of primus inter pares with the other task group commanders, which are Commodore Clapp and Brigadier Julian Thompson, until a fire brigade arrives and a major general arrives, Jeremy Moore. And that's far. That's what they run it from. They're running it from home, and that's with satellite communications, and that causes enough trouble in the Falklands War. This is in World War II with World War II level tech, with the Americans mucking around in the Japanese communications as often as they can, and the Brits and the Australians aiding and abetting and sometimes exceeding what the Americans are achieving. So, this is not sensible. If you're going to run a long distance operation of this size, you need a senior officer. And this is the other problem with Kazuki Kakuta. He is a vice admiral in 1944. He gets killed on the 2nd of August 1944, age 53. Or possibly commit suicide, we're not sure. He tries his best, but it's another vice admiral. So you've got 5 vice admirals involved in the situation, in this operation, and I'm checking my sums before I say it out loud. 4. Let's see. 2, 4, 5. 5 rear admirals. Oh, and actually you've got a 6th vice admiral because you've got the vice admiral submarines. Yeah. You have 6 vice admirals and 5 rear admirals running this scenario. It's absurd! And here's the thing. The Japanese are turning up to this battle with a fleet of 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 31 destroyers, 24 submarines, and 6 oilers. And roughly 750 aircraft. This is the American force structure, which is for 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 68 destroyers, and 28 submarines, and about 900 carrier aircraft. Remember what I said about how many rear admirals and vice admirals the Japanese have? They have 6 vice admirals and 5 rear admirals involved in that operation. Now, the American force is so numerous and small you can barely read it. But you will notice immediately there is an admiral along. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance in heavy cruiser Indianapolis. There is Task Force 58 under command of Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell. So we've got 1 admiral, 1 vice admiral to go. But he is aboard Lexington, which we will find in a minute. But there is then Task Group 58.1, which is centered around Carrier Division 13, run by Rear Admiral Joseph J. Clark. Supported by Rear Admiral Leo Theobald in Cruiser Division 10. They have 3 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers, anti-aircraft light cruisers, all as part of his division. And they then have a Captain Clark in charge of 14 destroyers to look after them. Then you have Task Group 58.2, which is under the command of Rear Admiral John W. Reeves. Okay, Carrier Division 2. Why am I talking about that? Oh, good Lord, Lexington is part of Carrier Division 2. So in other words, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell, the most experienced carrier admiral here, is only having to run Task Force 58, the fast carrier forces. He's not in charge of the division his carrier is in. That's under another admiral's command. So that means that instead of him having to worry about coordinating the defense of his carrier and making sure the strikes are getting off and all those sort of things, although he probably will get involved, They are done by someone else. And, oh, the heavy cruiser, which is within task group 58.2, that's the Indianapolis. So, Spruance is in the same task group, 58.2, and he's not trying to run it either. In fact, let's be honest, he's in the position where he has to deal with the least, because by the time a problem reaches him, it's far too late. Because if Reeves mucks up, Mitcher is right on top of him, and we'll be able to see from the other carrier which he's in, Lexington. And only if Mitcher manages to miss it, the Spruance have to get involved. So Spruance can afford to do a strategic role and think about things strategically, which is his role. And there's another Rear Admiral in that task group. Rear Admiral Robert W. Haler, in charge of the cruiser divisions. And then we have Carrier Division 12, Task Group 58.4, under Rear Admiral Carroll, who's very happy because he doesn't have, like Clark, doesn't have another more senior admiral in his task group. It's making him very happy. It's making him probably laugh a bit at Reeves. And you have a second Rear Admiral, William D. Baker, in charge of Cruiser Division 14 in that task group. There's your second in command. And then you have Task Group 58.7, commanded by Vice Admiral Willius Augustus Lee. And yes, there are a whole load of Rear Admirals in charge of the various battleships and cruiser divisions. They're all in this thing. But let's be honest, battleships are supposed to be taking losses, so that's why you tend to pack in more Rear Admirals. So, the Japanese, remember, had 6 Vice Admirals and 5 Rear Admirals involved. The Americans have 2 Vice Admirals, 1 Full Admiral, and then 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 10 Rear Admirals. And the Americans have a lot more ships there, and a lot more forces. So the Japanese have 11 officers, most of them the same senior rank, and the Americans have 13 admirals, most of them Rear Admirals, 2 Vice Admirals, and 1 Full Admiral. Who has the clear chain of command? It's going to be the Americans. Who knows exactly who's in charge, who's second in command, who takes over, what happens, who's in charge of what? It's the Americans, because when you have a load of officers of the same rank, even if they are the nicest people in the world, they will start going, but I don't take orders from you, I'm the same rank. Because think about it, when you're dealing with people in an office, or a school, or a university, the amount of time you probably hear people go, I have more time in post, I know what I'm doing, or it comes up. And you have a whole host of Vice Admirals trying to coordinate. Where's the Admiral? Back home. Trying to coordinate from a long way away. I'm not saying Japanese problems would have been solved if they'd taken one of the 3 stars and just gone, right then, you're now a Full Admiral. It would have probably created other problems. But at least it would have created a clear chain of command down there. And this feeds into their operational strength. Because yes, the Americans have far more. The Americans are relying on carrier aircraft, and they are bringing 900 to the party. The Japanese are bringing 450 carrier aircraft and 300 land-based aircraft, as I've said before. So they're bringing less aircraft, and it's a lot more complicated. So here's the paper analysis. The Japanese are outnumbered 5-3 in carriers. They're outnumbered 7-5 in battleships. They have a superiority of 3 heavy cruisers, but I will say this now. Perhaps World of Warships could be persuaded to run it, and we could do it as live. If anyone wants to, they can pick any level 10, a combination of 3 level 10 heavy cruisers they want. And I will fight them and coordinate 11 level 6 light cruisers and 37 level 6 destroyers. And we will see who wins. Okay? That is how confident I am that 11 light cruisers and 37 destroyers will outvote every single time 3 heavy cruisers. No matter how amazing they are. The torpedoes alone will cause a nightmare. So the only area where the Japanese outstrength the Americans is heavy cruisers. In fact, if you were being indiscreet, you would say, well, no, it would still be 3 because for both admirals will be drawn off in their heavy cruisers, so that would take them both sides down by 1. They are outnumbered 7-6 in submarines. The Japanese are supposed to be using submarines to whittle down the American fleet. There are more American submarines than there are Japanese submarines present. And the command and control issues. Yes, Japanese heavy cruisers are cool. Yes, they are very well armed. No, 3 heavy cruisers do not make up for being outnumbered in carriers, do not make up for being outnumbered in destroyers, in light cruisers. I wish they did, but they don't. For the Japanese sake alone, it would have been interesting. So here are the operations. Here's what's leading up. I know that's the Miyoko 1941, but she looks good there. So, the operations. Well, on the 12th of June 1944, US carriers had carried out airstrikes on the Marianas, which convinced Admiral Sumo Toyoda that the US was planning to invade the Marianas, which they were. The Japanese had presumed that the Americans were going to be far more conservative in their strikes. They thought they'd either go for the Carolinas or Palos, and had therefore protected the Marianas with only 50 land-based aircraft. On the 13th to 15th of June, the American carriers continued with additional airstrikes, and surface forces started to bombard the Marianas. And then on the 15th of June, the first American troops go ashore at Saipan. Now, here is the thing. You get control of Saipan, you get control of the Marianas, you bring your strategic bombers in range of the Japanese home islands. So, why the Japanese hadn't thought this was a likelihood, I do not know. But anyway, they now believe it's finally time for the Kantai Kessen. The decisive battle. What they've been trying to achieve since 1941 and December 1941. They finally think, oh, it's time in 1944. After we've lost most of the Kido Battalion, after we've lost pretty much everything, all our good leaders, we are now going to do it. Now, Jizaburo Ozawa is sent in his newly commissioned flagship, the Taiho, which was the Japanese, of course, answer to the armoured hangar carriers, to basically their equivalent to Midway, to them going, well, now we've all flown off the treaties honestly, we really quite like the idea of the armour the British have been putting on their carriers because it makes them survivable. Turns out they've been living. The Germans and the Italians keep claiming to have sunk them and they keep surviving and coming back again, like ghosts or zombie carriers. It's rather rude of the British. Anyway, we rather like this idea. We're going to go with it now. And so the Taiho is made, which had extensive command facilities as well, supposedly to support its admiral, and reinforced torpedo blisters, and its own large air group. It was supposed to be the ultimate weapon for them in the carrier war in the Pacific. And really, if it'd been worked up better, it could have been pretty devastating. Because, honestly, on paper, it should have been very, very effective against US Navy forces. Doesn't turn out to reality. Now, the first thing that goes wrong with their idea of charging in for a decisive battle is that on June the 15th, at around 6:35 in the evening, the USS Flying Fish, one of those pesky American submarines, they have 28 of them in the area, spots a Japanese carrier and battleship force coming out of the San Bernardino Strait. An hour later, the USS Seahorse, another pesky submarine, spots a battleship and cruiser force steaming up from the south, roughly 200 miles off Mindanao. Now, the submarines, the US submarines, are under orders. They report their sightings before they try to attack them. Why do you do this? Because after all, sending off a radio message like that, it could well reveal your position. Well, attacking will reveal your position anyway, and might get you killed. And frankly, the information is almost more valuable than the attack, because yes, you might sink an enemy ship, which is a great thing. We'll be very happy for you. But you might not. Whereas if the fleet knows the enemy's coming, they will maul them. They will. So as this is the case, Flying Fish actually waits until nightfall, then services to radio its report, and then starts tracking the enemy to attack. At this point, 5th Fleet Commander Spruance is convinced a major battle's coming, and rings up Nimitz at the Pacific Fleet headquarters, and says, can I reform my fleet and move west of Saipan into the Philippine Sea so I can block any Japanese attack on our forces? And Nimitz goes, yeah, go on. I'm not sure if Nimitz said, yeah, this will be a chance for a decisive battle. I don't think the Americans were really thinking like that. They were just thinking, Japanese are coming. We outnumber them. This is going to be fun. And he splits up his forces. So Task Force 52s, the older battleships and cruiser and escort carrier groups, are ordered to remain near Saipan to protect the invasion fleet. So this is the point again. When we're talking about Task Force 58, this force, this humongous organisation, that is one of two task forces 5th Fleet has under its command. He also has Task Force 52 behind him, which has old battleships, which has escort carriers, which we know from other operations can pack a nasty punch if they have to, and own escorts. So he's got two huge fleets. This, for the Japanese, is pretty much it. If it's available and floating, it's sent. They have a few bits more, but not much. Shortly before midnight on June the 18th, Nimitz radio sprints that a Japanese vessel had broken radio silence. The message was apparently from Ozawa to his counterpart, Kakuta, in charge of land-based air forces on Guam. This is one of those issues when you've got a split air group, when you've got one to land. You have to communicate to coordinate, and this helpfully gives them a position approximately 355 miles west-southwest of Task Force 58. That's thanks to the joy of radio direction finding. Now, at this point, the Americans are faced with a problem because the Japanese do have a habit of sometimes sending off a single vessel to break radio silence from a long way from their fleets to try and misdirect the Americans, to use the American intelligence gathering apparatus against them. But sometimes they don't. Now, at this point, Mitscher, Spruance, Arleigh Burke, to an extent, all consider it likely there's going to be a night action against the Japanese. That they now don't know where they are, and they should send Lee and his fleet forward. Lee is probably the most intelligent and best battleship commander you could possibly have in World War II. There are a few British commanders, again, who can get up there, but none really have the chance to command the fleets. He does, and you're pretty much talking Cunningham, etc. Well, nicest way, Cunningham has a slight advantage. He is commander of the Mediterranean Fleet. He can do a battle fleet as he wants to do it. Lee is commander of the battle fleet, yes, but it's one task group within the Task Force 58. He has Spruance as his big boss. It's slightly more difficult to maneuver. And Lee is definitely not enthusiastic. He points out his crews have not been adequately trained for night fighting. He knows how dangerous night fighting is. He doesn't want to do it. Mitscher hears Lee's opinion, and instead of trying to overrule him or compete with him, asks permission from Spruance to move Task Force 58 west during the night so that they could have a launch position in dawn to allow for a maximum air assault, basically the Alpha Strike doctrine of their carrier groups. Spruance refuses Mitscher's request, and he has a reason for this. Basically, he knew that the Japanese weren't targeting his fleet. They wanted to get to the Marines. They wanted to get the amphibious forces trying to take back the Marianas. His fleet was the force blocking them. If the enemy could find him, that was a good thing, because if they found him, they weren't finding the amphibious task group. Summing up, Spruance said, if we were doing something so important that we were attracting the enemy to us, we could afford to let him come and take care of him when he arrived. Basically, it's the opposite of Midway in 1942, but there's a reason for that. In 1944, Spruance knows they're coming, he knows where they're coming from, and he knows he has the superiority of numbers, and he knows he has the superiority of operational technology. He has working high-quality air control radar for 1944. He has fighter groups which are well-trained and well-coordinated. And he has escorts and the battleships which are well-drilled on how to operate under air attack. So, at daybreak on the 19th, or was it 20th? I've lost track. Anyway, the next day, Spruance suggests that if the daybreak searches reveal no targets, the bombers will be sent to attack the airfields at Rota and Guam. However, Mitchell responds that this is not possible because they've already expended all of their contact fuse bombs and basically their land attack weapons bombing the islands already. They only have armor-piercing bombs left, and armor-piercing bombs are not really that good for land attack. They tend to bury themselves in the ground and then go off. It's ishy. Anyway, as morning breaks, Task Force 58 launches search aircraft, the CAP, and the anti-submarine patrols. And then again turns west to gain maneuvering room from the islands. Using their Allied developed air control system, basically the British ideas and the American ideas have been fused by this point so much, and so much information going back and forth between the two, that by 1944 you have a very interesting, I would say the differences are mostly due to orientation of operations and the operations they're carrying out, rather than a difference in doctrine of air control by 1944. And the whole fleet is arranged so that any attackers get through the CAP, they would then bump into the gun line of screening battleship and cruisers. And then, once they got past that, there's more cruisers and destroyers, and then there's the carriers. And they all have guns, they all have proximity and variable time fused anti-aircraft fire. They have all sorts of things to try and give themselves defense. It's a very, very strong scenario. And this is what the Americans are capable of doing. So, this is the picture of the 19th of June, and this is the point at which we're up to. The Japanese used 50 aircraft stationed on Guam to try and find the American ships. And actually one of those, Mitsubishi A6M0, does find Task Force 58 at 5:50 a.m. Radios his sighting of the US ships. One of the Essex-class fleet carriers in Task Group 58.2 under Rear Admiral Montgomery. Lots of bombs coming very, very close, but luckily not hitting. As a result, the Japanese started launching their Guam-based aircraft for attack, but they don't coordinate with the carriers. So these aircraft are spotted by the US ships on their radar, and F-6F Hellcats are dispatched from Belleau Wood to deal with the threat, and they do. They actually arrive over the airfield while the Japanese aircraft are launching. So literally, the Japanese aircraft are launching and going, "We're going to get there! Fudge me, there's a lot of 50 cal around here. Where did this all come from? Oh, there's 30 Hellcats! Oh my..." It's your worst scenario. It's not air defense at that point. It's, we've spotted you trying to launch something. We're just going to put more above you than you can actually get off the ground at once. As a result, and perhaps unsurprisingly, 35 Japanese aircraft are shot down for the loss of a single Hellcat. And at 9:57, another large number of bogies are picked up approaching the fleet. Mitch says to Burke, "Get the fighters back from Guam." And then ordered all fighters still with the fleet aloft deploying layer upon layer of caps. So instead of deploying all aircraft forward in one cap, he has a cap forward, and he has another cap behind that, and another cap behind that. So the Japanese go, "We got past that cap! Yay! Oh, frick, there's another one!" And then another group goes, "We've got past the first two lines of cap. We're going to get to them. Oh, frick, there's another one." Because that actually makes life easier. Because instead of you trying to vector all the aircraft at once, you're vectoring Cap 1, Cap 2, Cap 3, Cap 4, Cap 5, Cap 6, Cap 7, Cap 8, whatever numbers you're calling them, or whatever groups you're calling them. And so you can concentrate on, this is the target, this is the cap in this range. Done, done, done. And it makes life easier for a control perspective. It makes it far more of a nightmare from an attacking perspective. While doing this, though, and while arranging that cap, he also sends his bomber aircraft aloft. He gets them out of his carriers, because otherwise they are very risky fire hazards. So as long as they're out on the carriers, they're safe. Yay! And he can use them later. These attacks now coming in and being detected are the carrier attacks. So here's the thing. The land aircraft were going to attack, and they do attack, but they attack early, and now the carrier's coming in. And the trouble is the carrier aircraft attack coming in is 68 aircraft. And then the Japanese decide that they are going to circle to regroup their formations for attack because they've got broken up in a long flight. Again, this is a problem of losing those veterans, of those experienced airmen, of not having the experience within the air groups as they're going. You need it to maintain your forces. Within 10 minutes, that time that they give allows them to get caught between not only the cap, but the returning Hellcats from attacking the airfields. So the Hellcats who've been over the airfield going, "We pounce on you," come back and go, "Oh, more targets! And we've still got ammunition." And they're in front of us, so they don't realise we're coming. Just, it's not fair. Again, the Japanese lose 25 aircraft for the loss of 1 US aircraft. It's experience of pilots. Japanese aircraft are not that bad in comparison to the American aircraft that they should be shot down at the rate of double figures to 1. They're not. If you had pilots of equivalent skill level in them, it would be nowhere near that figure. Within a few minutes, less than 27 aircraft of the attacking group, i.e. about a third of the attacking aircraft, remained. And they decide to pick to attack destroyers. And they don't cause any damage and get shot down with hulls. And there's a debate as to how many bombers, maximum of 6, managed to break through Lee's battleship group to try and attack. And that's to attack the battleship group. 1 bomb hits the main deck of South Dakota. Unfortunately, that kills or injures 50 men, but unsurprisingly, 1 bomb fails to disable her. And South Dakota's the only ship damaged in this attack. No aircraft of Oswald's first wave got through to the carriers. None at all. At 11:07, another raid is detected. A larger, even larger attack. This one consisted of 107 aircraft. They were met 60 miles out from the task force group. 60 miles away from task group 58. And 70 of the aircraft are shot down before they reach the ships. So there's only 37 left. 6 attack Admiral Montgomery's group, nearly hitting 2 of the carriers. They cause casualties, but they only nearly hit them. 4 of those aircraft are shot down. A small group of torpedo aircraft attack Enterprise. 1 torpedo explodes in the wake of the ship. 3 others attack Princeton, but all are shot down. In all, it's estimated 97 of the 107 attacking aircraft were destroyed. I'm fairly sure when I first showed this earlier on, all the air groups basically blacked out and saying pretty much they die, so I haven't bothered doing the exact figures. You probably thought I was overstating it. It's not called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for nothing. The Japanese are throwing perfectly good aircraft away with inexperienced crews. Perhaps if they decided not to attack at this point and instead take a few more months to train them up, they would have been better off, but they didn't. It carries on, and a third raid of 47 aircraft comes in at this point. 47 aircraft attack, and 40 fighters are directed to engage, while they're 50 miles out from the task force. 7 Japanese aircraft are shot down. Most broke, and some made an ineffective attack on the Enterprise group. 40 of those aircraft managed to return to their carriers, but I think mostly because they turned and moved out because they saw what had happened. The 4th Japanese raid never finds the US fleet. However, while they break up into 2 groups, and they decide to fly to Guam and Rota to refuel. The group flying to Rota stumbles across Montgomery's task group, and 18 aircraft lose half their number in a couple of minutes. 9 dive bombers managed to evade US aircraft and attack Wasp and Bunker Hill, but score no hits, and 8 of those aircraft are shot down. The larger of the groups of Japanese aircraft had flown to Guam, and they were intercepted over Oreto Field by 27 Hellcats when landing. So the Hellcats had returned and gone, ooh, well, we did good when they were trying to take off from here earlier. Now they're landing! Yay! They're low on the fuel, they can't do anything. It's just... I know there is sarcasm coming through, and I hope that's not offending anyone. It probably is, but I do apologise if it is. It's not. It's just... I find it such a waste. I can respond by crying or being sarcastic. Because these are brave airmen who have been thrown away. They should never have been in this situation. They should never have been at the point at which someone in them actually thought, oh, you know what a good idea is? Going and trying to land on an airfield in an area where the Americans know where the airfield is. Because the Americans have enough aircraft. They're going to have fighters there. They've already had fighters there. By this point, by the time the 4th wave is sent airborne, launching between 11 and 11:30 a.m., they surely have managed to get out to the carriers, or, well, should have got out to the carriers, what had been happening between 9 and 10 a.m. that morning. I.e., that they'd had their fighters being shot down, their aircraft being shot down. Aboard Lexington afterwards, this is where the name for this area, this battle comes from. Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot, is said. Hence the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost, including Oreto Field, over 350 planes on the first day of battle. About 30 American planes were lost, and only the South Dakota was damaged. And unsurprisingly, able to remain in formation and to continue her anti-aircraft duties. Unsurprisingly, most of the pilots, according to the Japanese own sources, who managed to evade the US fighter screens were the small numbers of seasoned veterans who had survived, some of them, even the 6-month Japanese advance of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal campaign. They're seasoned veterans who had been kept on the front lines instead of being used to train people. Now it turns over to nighttime, and whilst the Americans and the Japanese both thought about it, they decided not to go for a night bomb engagement between these two gentlemen and their fleets. It would have been interesting if it had happened. It would have certainly been a battle. It really would have been. But it doesn't happen. Mainly because I still think that whatever the advantage that Yamato and Musashi would have brought to the battle, I don't think Matome Ugaki is anywhere near Lee's equivalent in terms of battleship command and capability. I also think that a 7-5 advantage means that at the very least those Yamamotos are dealing with 2 battleships at a time, which, yes, they're theoretically designed for, but no one actually wants to deal with 2 battleships at a time. Or alternatively, Lee uses his Iowas to hold off the Yamamotos and rolls up the other Japanese battleships and takes them out. Either way, I think he wins. Although he doesn't want to fight at night, remember. He's trying to avoid it. He doesn't think it'd be good for his forces. He's quite happy to engage them in the daytime, but he considers night fighting to be an art, and he hasn't had enough time, in his view, to train his forces to the level of art which he thinks is necessary. Even despite the fact that more of his battleships had radar control and radar guidance for their gunnery than the Japanese did. He's a good commander, and he knows what he's doing. So now you get to the 20th of June, and here you have submarine attacks going on, which have been causing fun throughout the 19th of June. The submarine attacks, and they are starting to add up. Albacore, which cited Oswald's own carrier group, managed to attack the Taiho. And whilst her fire control computer failed and he fired Deadeye, he did fire 6 torpedoes in a single spread to ensure he hit. Taiho had just launched 42 aircraft for the second raid when the Albacore fired its torpedo spread. 4 veered off target of those 6 torpedoes. And a very brave pilot, Saikyo Komatsu, the pilot of one of the recently launched aircraft, managed to spot one of the 2 which were heading for Taiho and diverted its path and dived into its path and detonated it. The 6th torpedo strikes the carrier on the starboard side, ruptures 2 aviation fuel tanks, and Albacore managed to get away with minor damage from depth charges. So Taiho, they think, is minor. They think flooding's been quickly contained and carrier's propulsion navigation are unaffected. Unfortunately, the gasoline vapor from the ruptured fuel tanks, and this is made worse by the type of fuel the Japanese are using. The Japanese have not been able to refine the fuel. They're not able to get good quality fuel at this point because their refinery is all back in the home islands. And so they have to get the fuel from where it's extracted, take it back home, refine it, and bring it back. They don't have the ability to do this. They have lost so many tankers, and they're going to lose more in this operation. They're not able to do that. So what they're doing instead, what they're having to do instead, is use the fuel they've got with minimal refining, which is not good. It means it builds up more gas, it does more damage to engines, it requires more cleaning. Basically, it makes everything a lot worse and reduces your ships and your aircraft's top speed. It's just terrible. So, gasoline vapor is beginning to fill the hangar tanks, and at this point, Taiho falls victim to very poor damage control, as an officer decides that the way to clear the explosive fumes is to order her ventilation system to operate at full blast. Now, that's a lovely idea if you have separate ventilation systems which extract from the hangar straight out and from the ship. Instead, what happens is it causes all the vapor fumes to spread around the ship. And then a spark from an electric generator on the hangar deck ignites the fumes. Whilst the first explosions make it clear that Taiho is doomed, Oswa and his staff are transferred to nearby Zukaku. Soon thereafter, though, a second series of explosions go off, and the Japanese lose 2,150. Well, of the crew of 2,150, they lose 1,650 personnel. And again, this was the new leading carrier of the Japanese Navy. It had had the pick of the creme de la creme of the experienced officers and aircrew. Oh, sugar. More of that experienced personnel lost. Task Force 58 had sailed west during the night, but they attacked the Japanese at dawn. Admiral Osworth finally reaches Zukaku at 1 o'clock on the 20th and learns of what had happened the previous day and that he had about 150 aircraft left. However, believing there were still hundreds of aircraft on Guam and Rota, because no one had informed him there weren't, and there was no one in charge finding out if there weren't, he started planning for launching new raids on the 21st, i.e. the following day. However, Task Force 58 is slowly using its aircraft superiority to expand its search circle. The early morning, June 20th, finds nothing, but the midday search finds even less, which has gone even further. At 12:15, an Enterprise search plane indicates a sighting. No, not 12:15, at 3:15 in the afternoon. And at 24, the sighting is verified, along with a distance, course, and speed. The Japanese fleet was at 275 miles, moving due west at a speed of 20 knots. They were therefore at the limit of Task Force 58 strike range, and daylight was slipping away, but Mitchell launched everything. He could. They then get a second message, which suggests the Japanese are 60 miles further away after they've launched the first strike, and Mitchell decides to cancel the second launch of aircraft, but not recall the first strike. The attack that lands on the Japanese is 226 aircraft, out of the 240 that are launched. 14 are bought for various reasons and returned to ships. 95 fighters, Hellcats, carrying 500-pound bombs. 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, mostly carrying 4 500-pound bombs, but a few carrying torpedoes. 71 dive bombers, 51 Hell Diver type, and 26 Dauntlesses. They arrive over the Japanese fleet just before sunset. Oswa managed to mount up 35 fighters for air defense, and they don't have the command and control the Americans and the British would have at this point. It would have been good by 1939 standards. Honestly, by 1942, the British were operating on the idea of an 18 for a single carrier, 36 for a pair of carriers air groups, so 35 would have been fine. But by 1944 standards, it wasn't. The first things the carrier strikes, the American carriers, American aircraft that strike are the oilers. This stops Oswald being able to refuel, but oilers are critical assets. They're just as important as carriers for the Japanese at this point. Losing them is a crippling blow. And that's the Wasp air group. They dive on tankers. 3 of them are taken out. And the reason the Wasp air group do it is because they've launched in many ways from the furthest away, so they're the lowest on fuel. So they are far more concerned with attacking the Japanese and getting home and their fuel levels than they are with finding the carriers. Then the Hio, the converted carrier, is attacked and hit by bombs and aerial torpedoes from 4 Avengers from the Belleau Wood. She sinks with a loss of 250 men and officers. Next off this, the carriers Zukaku, Junio, and Chiyoda are damaged by bombs. They're, how do I put this, not completely crippled, but they are damaged. And the reason the Americans think they're crippled is the same reason as Japanese pilots assess American carriers are crippled. They do huge geysers when a bomb goes off close to a ship in the water. Huge, and they look like a bag explosion, but no. The battleship Haruna's also hit by 2 bombs, one directly on the main battery turret, but she's able to keep station, and her captain orders her turret magazine to be flooded to avoid an explosion, and that stops her sinking or anything. 20 American aircraft in the strike are destroyed by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. And at this point, after the strike's over, the Americans realised that most of the aircraft returning to carriers would be dangerously low on fuel, and night had fallen. And the American aircraft, how do I put this? If we were talking about the Royal Navy at this time, I would be iffy but fairly confident because they have a lot of experienced pilots who really know about night flying, and night flying training is a key part of British doctrine and British operations still in 1944, which air task groups regularly practice. They don't do it if they don't have to, because it's a risk. It's always a risk. But it's something they regularly practice. The Americans practice it less often than the British. They didn't start out in 1939 to 1941 with a fully all aircraft, all pilots, all air groups are night flying capable. They didn't start out with that kind of force. They hadn't built that kind of force at that point. And they still haven't got to it really in 1944, and they aren't doing the level of training. So they are really, really worried about this, and it turns out they have a good reason to be. Because they're going to have trouble finding their carriers, Clark orders Hornet and several other carriers to turn on their lights and shine their searchlights directly up in the sky. This would risk, of course, Japanese submarines and any night-flying aircraft, but It doesn't matter. And Mitchell backs him up immediately. And so Task Force is lit up like a bright, like a beacon. And there are even picket destroyers firing star shells to help the aircraft come back. They're doing everything they can to get their aircraft home. Planes were given clearance to land on any aircraft of any flight deck available, not just the home carriers, so they could land wherever, whenever, as most they could, and they sorted that out the next day. However, the point is this. The Americans lost 20 aircraft fighting the Japanese in the strike. They lose 80. Crashing into flight decks, ditching into the sea, and their engines running dry from lack of fuel. 3/4 of the crews are rescued from the sea, either at night or the next day, a few days. But that is the reality. The Americans lose more aircraft from flying at night than they do from enemy action. That's how dangerous it is. That's the final reason for why admirals don't want to do it when they can avoid it. More aircraft are lost from night flying and from the navigational and operational issues of night flying than are lost from enemy action for the Americans. Overall, US losses are 1 battleship damaged, 123 aircraft destroyed, 80 of them, remember, 2/3 due to the night strike and coming home, and 109 dead. Again, a vast majority of those, in terms of the pilots lost, are lost from the night flying. "50 are lost on 1 battleship. Japanese have lost 3 fleet carriers, 2 oilers. 1 is more severely damaged. Their own figures aren't quite sure. It could be as many as 645. It could be as little as 550 aircraft destroyed. 6 other ships, well, 5 including, and not including that oiler I mentioned earlier, also damaged. Nearly 3,000 dead. That is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese tried to turn an American attack into their decisive battle. They can't bring enough forces. They can't coordinate the forces they have. They don't have the command structure necessary to coordinate those forces. And the Americans end up losing more to Mother Nature, to the night, than they do to the enemy action in terms of aircraft. Here's a picture of the Kido Butai. And I thought if I'm going to spend quite a lot of this time hammering the Kessen I'll make sure I get this right. The Kantai Kessen decisive battle doctrine, I should at least talk about what might have been if it had achieved. The thing is, it is a good idea if it works. If you can get the enemy, even if you can't whittle them down much, but you can get them to come to you, so they're in their logistics line when you attack them, and you can overwhelm them, it's viable. Honestly, the Kido Butai and the Japanese battle fleet was well enough trained in 1941 that would have given them a superiority, at least an equivalence to the American numbers. And the American numbers, remember, aren't necessarily as superior as they seem. They have whole carriers which they'd rather not be anywhere near the Pacific theatre. They have whole battleships which they are still trying to replace. The Japanese fleet has been upgraded far more than the American fleet in terms of total hulls. So, or in terms of sort of quantity. So that's the reality. They could have done it if the Americans had played ball. If the Americans, and this is the big thing, the Americans would have had to have gone along with the Japanese plan. The Americans would have had to have let it happen. I doubt they would. I love the Americans. I love the Japanese. They are both wonderful people. And they have rich histories. But neither of them are stupid. Yet both of them spend quite a lot of World War II planning for the other side being stupid. You can argue that the Americans in the 1920s and 30s are planning for the Japanese being stupid, and that's what leads to Pearl Harbor and various other events, because they just don't believe the Japanese could pull it off. The whole long lance torpedo and the disbelief of the Japanese having such a long range weapon is a classic example of this. The Japanese plan is based on the Americans being super aggressive and charging in. Now, I know if you've watched a few too many westerns, you certainly get that idea of the American personality. But if you watch their actual battle performance and their operations, even some of their most aggressive commanders, Patton, Sherman, Grant, Thompson, and Thomas. They are aggressive, but they're not stupid. They don't tend to charge headlong into traps. Nimitz certainly wasn't. Spruance, as aggressive as he could be, no. Mitscher, under no circumstances. You cannot plan war, and this is the ultimate lesson of the Pacific War or the Philippine Sea. You cannot plan your battles presuming your opponents are idiots. You cannot prepare for future conflict. You cannot deter future conflict if you preserve the belief that your opponents are idiots. Credit them with as much intelligence as you credit yourself. Otherwise, you run into trouble. Otherwise, you end up sending a lot of people home in boxes. So, after that happy note, what have we got coming up? We have Patron 27, Andronau, Actions of the French Navy, Model 1. Currently live is the vote for the patron choices of July. And 27th of June, Brew Ships 52, Year of Brew Ships. There is going to be more put up soon, but I wanted to just put these through and make them happy. And we've got Camperdown Rounds Victoria, a long patrol on 22nd of June. 29th of June, we have the Battle of Athos. And then the 3rd to 11th of July, we have the Sea Power behind the Ring of Stone. We have lots more coming as well that I'm going to be adding in a bit. But I hope you enjoy these. Thank you very much, everyone who's watched today. And I'm going to finish by saying, well, probably at this point there's no one watching, but if there is anyone watching, thank you for watching the whole way through. I hope you found it useful. If any of these long patrols you would like to ask questions and I'd like to do a live on, please comment down below, send me a message on Discord, and if enough people are interested, I will quite happily do a live and discuss some of the things that have been brought up. And thank you for your support. Thank you to people who like the videos. Thank you to people who subscribe. Thank you to people who share the videos. Thank you to people who are patrons and who've joined the channel. Both wonderful groups. Someone was asking me the other day, which one do you get more of? I think it's you get 70% from the joining the YouTube, and you get 75%, I think, from Patreon. I'm not sure quite on the figures. They seem to change because ones includes fees and the other ones is just a straight percentage. So it gets kind of interesting. Both are supportive. Both are wonderful. Thank you. And I'm going to rest my voice now for about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to do a live on the Siege of Gibraltar. Hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you, and take care. And that was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, aka the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Thank you. Take care. Hope you're having a nice weekend, and sorry no brew ships this weekend. As you know, I'm away, but thank you.